YouTube. All right, you're live. Fantastic. All right. Well, hello, those of you joining on Zoom. We're looking today here at Jonah chapter 4. Let's review a bit about where we have been. This is a Bible study, and so we're looking at how to study the Bible while we study the Bible. And so first, some reviews. When I study the Bible, at least, I'm always looking for observations and connections. I'm looking for any cross references. After I've done those things, then I'm thinking about interpretation. When I get to that point, the question is, what is the significance of XYZ? So, like we'll see today in Jonah chapter 4, the ending is a bit abrupt, you might say. And so the observation might be that ending is a little bit abrupt. Fantastic observation. The simplest observations often lead to the most profound interpretations and applications. And so the way that we would take an observation like that ending is a little abrupt and turn it into an interpretive question is by asking ourselves, what is the significance of the abrupt ending, right? And then lastly, we're going to ask the question, so what? And the so what question is the question of application. Why does this matter? What does this have to do with me? Okay. Now back up, when we're doing observations and connections, there are a couple things that I'm always looking for. The biggest of which, some of you'll remember this from past weeks, is repetition. Repetition. I'm looking for repetition. I'm looking for scene changes, which is just another way of saying breaks in the text. I'm looking for action verbs, etc. Okay. There might be a word that seems particularly interesting. That would be when you might do a word study or get into the original language a bit if you have the tools to do that. Now, last week of any text, what does it tell us about God? What does it tell us about the world? What does it tell us about ourselves? What does it tell us about how we ought to relate to God? And how does it point to Jesus? These are some of the key questions that we're always wanting to ask of a text as we come to it to study. Tonight, we are looking at Jonah chapter 4. That's where I prepped it. And here we are, Jonah. We saw in Jonah chapter 3 that Jonah finally vomited up on dry land after spending 3 days in the belly of a fish, and he makes the long trek to we did a little bit of research together last week, and what was it, like a 40-day walk or something? And he finally gets to Nineveh, and he announces what God told him to announce, and the people respond, and God forgives them. So we saw part 1, Jonah was invited to go. In the second section, the people of Nineveh repent. And then in the third section, we saw grace. And here we are, Jonah chapter 1. Pleased Jonah exceedingly, and he angry. Circle that word, angry. We got a little repetition there already. He's displeased, exceedingly displeased, and angry, right? Verse 1, the obvious observation is Jonah is not happy. And so what does he do? He prays to the Lord. Jonah prayed to the Lord, and he said, "O Lord, is not this what I said when I was yet in my country? This is why I made haste to flee Tarshish. For I knew that you are merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster." Therefore, here's my obvious observation. Jonah is a bit dramatic. This seems to be a bit of an overreaction, perhaps. And the Lord said to him, "Do you do well to be angry?" All right. So I'm going to circle angry in red because we saw that right back here, didn't we? Angry. We saw it once. Here, angry. Time. All right. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat in it, under it, in the shade, till he should see what would become of the city. So the Lord God appointed. I'm going to circle that word. A plant and made it come up over Jonah, that it might be a shade over his head to save him from his discomfort. So shade, I'll make the shade green. Shade. He's worried about Jonah here. And Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. Okay. So up here, who's back in the Jonah is exceedingly displeased. And now Jonah is exceedingly glad. That is a compare and a contrast, is it not? Jonah seems to be going through some mountaintops and some valleys here. He is exceedingly angry, dismayed at God's mercy, and now he's exceedingly glad. Why? Because of the plant. But when dawn came up the next day, God appointed, we've got some repetition. God appointed a worm that attacked the plant so that it withered. And when the sun rose, God appointed, what did he appoint? A scorching east wind. And the sun beat down on the head of Jonah so that he was faint. So he was hiding from the sun before. Now he can't hide from the sun. And what is Jonah going to do here? He asked that he might die. We saw this again. For it is better for me to die than to live. Take my life. It is better for me to die. That's the second time you've said that. And God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry? Now, that just appeared, didn't he? Do you angry? I see the word angry again. It's the third time. Because of the plant. Yes, I do well to be angry. Number 4. Angry enough to die. Number 5. And we've got him dramatic here. Die, boom, boom. And up here, die. And the Lord said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor. The word seems important to me, labor. You did not, nor did you make it grow night and perished in a night. And should I not pity Nineveh, that great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle? Okay, what's up with the cattle? We're just going to right there. Okay. That's how it ends. That is how Jonah chapter 4 ends. It ends so abruptly. And I must confess, I have no idea why that final phrase is, and there's also cows. Molly, I see a hand in that Zoom meeting. Yes. Do you have a take on the cows?
I do, because we learn that God really likes barbecue by the acts of worship. And so he sees that cattle as, lost potential barbecue.
All right. So Molly's suggestion as to why the cattle is because he loves barbecue. And so he wants to save the cattle.
In the temple, they sacrifice, and it's a pleasing aroma to the
Lord. We're just I'm not sure that it has anything to do with temple sacrifices. It may. Okay. I see the facetiousness in that comment. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to mark that. Okay. And also much cattle, because that's a really interesting thing. Like, that's an observation. The interpretive question would be, what's up with the cows? And actually it could be all sorts of things, right? It could be that God wants to make sure that they've got plenty to eat. Who knows? That cattle.
I like your interpretation.
The answer is barbecue.
No, not really of the sacrifice.
Yeah.
I think there's something to that. I can't see any other reason why it would be in there. I like that a lot. And they would have they would be sacrificing for their sins. I think it follows.
So
I never thought of that.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So it could be that they can.
Oh,
Yeah, go ahead,
I was
Vicki.
just going to ask if what the sacrifice is for the cattle. I'm just reading through Leviticus, and there's certain sacrifices that you have to have certain animals.
Yeah.
So
Now, I don't know the answer to that, but what I do know is that by this point, there is a robust sacrificial system. But the sacrificial system is all centered around Jerusalem, not Nineveh. Yeah, George.
Isn't there something in the Psalms like the Lord's goodness or his love is over all that he has made?
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
I don't know who these 120,000 are who can't tell their right hand from their left. It just might be kids who are not even old enough to know what's right and wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he loves even the kids, not to mention the adults. And while you're at it, even all your livestock, your cows and sheep and goats, and
Bare minimum.
whatever.
The original Hebrew is animals.
Oh. All right, let's look.
okay, I've got a Tanakh
Let's nerd out here.
animals.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, means livestock. A dumb beast, especially any large quadruped or animal. So often collectively cattle, but it could be the livestock of the people. I mean, it's probably their means of surviving, of eating, maybe a significant part of their economy. Yeah. Okay, let's do this, because there's a lot here. That ending is so sudden. That's what I want to say. All right. Now, first, maybe let's count up together how many times the word angry is used in these 11 verses. All right. So we see it. It's once here in verse 1. And then if we come back over here, second in verse 4, 2, 3, verse 9, 4, verse 9, 5, verse 9. I feel like maybe there was a sixth somewhere too. At least 5 times.
There's slow to anger.
That's right.
Slow to anger.
That's right.
Word or not,
It is the same word.
but you can check it out.
Slow to anger. So the word anger is used 6 times. And there's a compare and a contrast there, isn't there? God is slow to anger, is angry. He's exceedingly angry. I don't know, for me in my personal life, or my life in general, whenever I feel myself start to get angry, that's usually a sign that I need to slow down and pay attention to something, right? That seems to be the case here as well. Jonah, he argues with him and he tells him how he really feels. All right. We see that the Jonah certainly is dramatic, but Jonah also, he tells God how he feels. In some way, shape, or form, he presses in, right? He sticks with it, even though he's unhappy. And he argues with God. There is a time-honored tradition in the Bible of arguing with God. And here we see it for us. And you can see that God, it doesn't seem to me, at least, like he's put off by Jonah's anger, is he? Instead, he sticks with him. He explains himself, and he has an object lesson in the midst of Jonah's anger to try to break through. That's the plant. And we see the repetition here with the word appointed to scorching east wind. So the observation is God is the one who does this. God appoints the plant. God appoints the worm. God appoints the wind, the lengths. And we said, what was that? We've said it every week, that Jonah is ultimately at its core, it's not really a story about Jonah. I mean, but ultimately, the story of Jonah is a story of God's grace. And here we see it. God is the one who acts, God is the one who's sovereign. And even the shade here is grace. We've got dramatic Jonah, we've got gracious God. Now, let's look at the top here, verse 2. Jonah makes an observation about God that is really interesting. Okay. He says, I knew this God, your gracious God, merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, and relenting from disaster. It seems to me that Jonah actually knows God pretty well. He knows God pretty well. It was Eugene Peterson in the book I mentioned earlier to you all, Under the Unpredictable Plant, who notes that Jonah knows about God, but he doesn't really understand the ways of God. And that seems awfully true here. He knows God, but he doesn't quite get it. Of course, that may be fair. I was talking about this text with some friends earlier this week, and they noted that the Ninevites really were greatly evil. They really were greatly evil, like the sort of people who flayed their enemies alive. And so perhaps if anybody deserved it, it might have been them. And yet still, they repent, and God is merciful. I think that's at the heart of the story is Jonah's ups and downs, but even more than that, the grace of God. There's a lovely book for those of you who like to read. I think I've got it here on my shelf, actually. It's called Jonah and the Worm. I had to read it. I've got it somewhere close. I had to read it it was assigned to me at Fuller in seminary, and it tells parallel stories of how God sends Jonah, who takes his time getting there, shall we say, and then it also tells the story of the worm that God sends. It's a kid's book, but wonderful. Highly recommend it to help you sort of enter into the story using your imagination. Let's do this. Look with me at verse 9. We're jumping around a little bit here tonight, but that's because there's all these key words. God appointed, God appointed, God appointed. And then we see here in verse 9, God himself said, you pity the plant for which you did not labor. You didn't do the work, nor did you make it grow. Pointing again to the grace of God. Came into being in a night and perished in a night. You care about that. Oh, but Jonah, he's saying, you don't care about the 120,000 people. You don't care about the 120,000 people. Now, let me just say, this rings true to my own experience. Jonah himself has experienced grace, right? He said no to God. He ran the opposite direction. God saved him and brought him back, invited him back into, God invites Jonah back into his story and sends him. Jonah gets to participate in what can only be described as a massive revival. And yet he's angry about it, bitter about it, cynical about it. They don't deserve it. And here's what I found myself thinking over the last week. How true is that of us? There's and this is just, when we study the Bible, it's good to try to place ourselves in the story as we can. And for me, gosh, there's a tendency and a temptation to forget grace. There's a tendency and a temptation to forget grace. There's an inclination in my own heart to hard-heartedness towards God. And there's a tendency in my own heart to hard-heartedness towards those who don't yet know and follow Jesus. I don't know if you ever experienced that. This is something in my own life I found myself needing to guard against. Hardness of heart towards God, but also hardness of heart towards the lost. Jonah is hostile here towards the Ninevites. Here's what I've found myself wondering. It is easy sometimes to be hostile. I'm wondering if perhaps what's even more damaging is our indifference towards God and our indifference towards lost people. This is just what I've been thinking about as I've studied this text over the last week. Is my heart like Jonah's? And sometimes it is. Sometimes it is. And I can find myself hard-hearted towards the grace of God and hard-hearted towards the lost. I can find myself wondering, oh, do they deserve this? Which is the dumbest question, because of course they don't. And I don't either. And that's where God's grace towards Jonah is just so profound with the plant, right? It's all grace. It's all grace. Vicky.
I think it's interesting that I see it as Jonah's self-absorption and his need to have what he says carried out. And I think it's interesting in the second verse, he knows God. He knows
That's right.
what God is capable of, but I still need to be honored in the way he comes across. If I'm going to go through all of this, then you need to do what I'm telling them is going to happen to them.
Yeah.
And then, again, with the plant, it's, I needed this plant and you took it away from me. So it's that whole self-ego that comes out for me in Jonah.
Yeah, it's me versus an understanding of the grace of God, right? He knows it.
He recognizes it, but he doesn't fully internalize it.
Or perhaps even we could say he knows it, but it hasn't changed him.
Yes, he hasn't internalized what that means.
He knows God, but he doesn't get the way of God.
Prophet too.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing I wondered is, you said here Nineveh is this evil kingdom, and he's been a prophet to Israel and doesn't see them turning and things positive happening where he's prophesying, and now he's going to go to this evil kingdom, and he knows God's going to be gracious.
Yeah. Come on.
It's almost like stingy isn't the right word here, but the opposite of being generous. With God's grace.
Yeah.
Like he takes on God's grace, very like as a matter of fact. Oh, yes, of course I have shade now. Like he takes on God's grace for himself, but he can't watch it. He's not ready to share it. He can't watch it when it reminds me of when my kids were little, and one of them would be getting in trouble, and the other one would have kind of a grin on just a little bit of a grin on their face as they walk away, because they're not getting in trouble,
Yeah.
And so it almost reminds me a little bit of that. Like he was kind of hoping that the destruction of the Lord would come down.
Yeah.
And he didn't get to see it.
Yeah.
Perplexity. It's a complex emotion.
Yeah. Eugene Peterson puts it like this. He says, he knows God, and yet he's still a stranger to grace.
Yeah.
He's still a stranger to grace. Can I tell you a story? This has made me think about a story in my own life. Can I tell you a little bit about fundamentalist Mike? When I went away to college, I studied in the religion department at a secular liberal arts university, and let's just say it. There weren't a lot of Christians in this department, okay, or in my classes, which I think was a good thing. But the way that 18-year-old Mike responded to that was by swinging towards a sort of rigid fundamentalism where I know what I know and it's right and I can prove it. This sort of certainty that comes with it. I call it my fundamentalist Calvinist stage. Lots of young men and some young women go through this stage, usually when they're young. And because the certainty of it is really appealing. And my freshman and sophomore year of college, that was me. I was willing and eager to argue with anyone and everyone. I was certain I was right. I was mighty annoying and not particularly fruitful, right? The fruit of the Spirit did not abound in me. But I was eager to grow and learn and know, right? It's not all bad. But I can remember when Jesus changed fundamentalist Mike. And here's what happened. I went away for a semester to study abroad. Okay. And I made some friends that I really loved who didn't know Jesus. And I went to Scotland and I was studying theology and reading all this, wonderful stuff. But mostly I was spending my evenings with these friends that I grew to love. And I watched as these friends that I loved tried to fill their lives with all sorts of things that couldn't satisfy them. Right. And what happened to me over the course of those 3 months, as I spent more time talking about faith in pubs and less time arguing about predestination than I ever did in my first 2 years of undergrad, is that Jesus began to break my heart for people who didn't know him. And I remember feeling so convicted that I spent more time arguing with people about predestination or creation or whatever, Catholicism, than I did talking about Jesus. I was like grace. And I didn't begin grace until I actually started to love people who needed grace. And as I started to love people who needed grace, I started to understand how God's grace had worked in my own life. And I can tell you, I came back a different person, much softer hearted, much more eager to talk about Jesus, much more interested in grace. And what do you know? The fruit of the Spirit began to be a little bit more present in my life, shall we say. The reason that I can speak about the hard-heartedness of Jonah is because that's my lived experience, right? But it's also my lived experience over the last 15 or 20 years. As I have grown in grace, I also find myself sometimes tempted to return to that sort of hard-hearted indifference to people who don't know Jesus yet. And this is, for me at least, the application of Jonah chapter 4 is, gosh, God, thank you so much for the grace that you've bestowed in my life, for the way that you've changed my life. And please, please keep my heart soft towards you and towards others. Please keep my heart soft and gentle and broken for those who don't know you yet, that they might come to know you. Now, let's talk about the open-endedness here of Jonah 4, because I love this ending. It reminds me a little, if you know your Bible, of the ending of Mark. The Gospel of Mark ends rather suddenly and it doesn't finish the story. Like Mark doesn't finish the story. And because it's an invitation, I think part of the reason is because it's an invitation for us to enter the story. We don't know how Jonah ends. Maybe it matters what happens to Jonah after this. Maybe it doesn't. Jonah's not the point, though, right? If Jonah's not the point, then, well, we can wonder. The point is God, who ends here in verse 11 with grace, just as he starts chapter 1 with grace. And we see this line throughout Jonah, this thread of grace, of a God who is gracious and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. We can trace the grace. We can see it in the first call to Jonah. We can see it in the way that he draws the sailors on the ship to himself. We can see it in the way that he invites Jonah again to go to Nineveh. We can see it in the way that he forgives the Ninevites. We can see it in the plant. We can see it in the way that God doesn't put Jonah off, even though Jonah doesn't get it. He doesn't get fed up with Jonah. He doesn't write Jonah off. He doesn't send him away. Instead, he sends him an illustration. Instead, he sticks with him, right? And I think it ends there because the story for Christians begins and ends with the grace of God. The story for Christians always begins and ends with the grace of God. And so the open-endedness for Jonah, I think this is my interpretive bit. And as we send those of you on Zoom to breakout groups here in a moment, maybe you disagree with me, and you should talk about that. I think it leaves it open-endedness because we're supposed to draw our eyes to God. We're not supposed to wonder about Jonah. I mean, maybe a little. I think we're supposed to put ourselves in Jonah's shoes. Like, what would we do here? How am I like Jonah? I think that's part of it. And we're supposed to draw our gaze upwards to the grace of God. Do you do well to be angry? Do you do well to be angry? We see that question twice. The way that God sticks with him reminds me a little bit of God calling out to Adam and Eve in the garden, "Where are you?" Here Jonah is lost in his anger, and God lovingly engages him, even as God receives, tolerates, even perhaps encourages Jonah to bring his anger to him.
It reminds me too of Moses and his reluctance to